Well, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. Really happy you're here with us tonight. Tonight we have a very serious and sobering topic to talk about, and that is the project that was called the Manhattan Project. Manhattan Project was a secret project that happened the 4 years in between 1942 and 1945, and it was the project run by the U.S. government in response to intelligence that they had that the Germans were working on a nuclear bomb or an atomic bomb. And it was the U.S. response to that to try to get to the atomic bomb before the Germans could perfect it. This was happening the year after the fission of materials in plutonium. And Americans knew about it and had figured out how to do it. The British had figured out how to do it, and the Germans also had figured out how to do it. And they were seeing that the possibilities for explosions from a bomb that could be produced out of the fission of nuclear material coming out of plutonium could be catastrophic and could be a game changer on the battlefield. And so the United States, after hearing from Professor Albert Einstein, who actually approached FDR and his administration and told them about the German project, they decided to respond to Einstein by creating a project of our own, which was termed the Manhattan Project. You can see in the pictures behind me a gentleman named Robert Oppenheimer, who ended up joining the project in 1943. He was not on the original team, but joined as one of the top physicists in the world and scientists, and understood nuclear energy very well. He had a lot of concepts about what they could do to try to speed up the process of enrichment of plutonium and try to get to the bomb first and how to design that bomb to make it effective. And so he joined in 1943. After the secret project had been put together, he ended up establishing a base out in Los Alamos, New Mexico, with a test area that they put together called the Trinity Project, which was a sub-project to the Manhattan Project. In addition, there was a large tract of land that was put together in Tennessee. Actually, people were kicked out of their homes and their properties and told that it was a secret government project and not to ask any questions. And that particular area of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, was the other area that was the most important research laboratory in the Manhattan Project itself. So tonight we're going to talk all about the Manhattan Project, the history behind it, the history behind Robert Oppenheimer, who was the key driver of the project after he took over in 1943. We'll talk about the testing of the bomb itself in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and then the readying of the bomb for the battlefield in 1945. And then, of course, we're going to also talk about the very important decision that President Truman had to make, which was he going to drop the first ever nuclear bombs on Japan to try to get them to capitulate and to have an unconditional surrender to end the war? Understanding that his decision was such a critical and heavy one, largely because the Germans had surrendered, the Americans had won the war in Europe, but the Japanese were very stubborn and refused to surrender, and what the Americans were looking at in having to, with the Allies, invade Japan was potentially hundreds of thousands of more deaths of Allied soldiers to try to capture Japan. And that just seemed so terrible to the commanders at the time and to the president that they decided to go forward and drop this absolutely horrific weapon that had never been tested before on the battlefield. So we'll get into all those details tonight, the heavy consequences of this particular project, the bomb itself, the decision to drop it, the two different bombs that devastated two cities in Japan. And then also we'll talk a little bit about Robert Oppenheimer and his quest to stop the bomb ever being used again after he saw with horror it being used on the battlefield. And he spent the rest of his career after the war speaking against and pushing against the bomb ever being used again on any continent or any territory. So we'll get into all those things tonight. Let's go ahead and talk about it. So the Manhattan Project was a U.S. government research project from 1942 to 1945 that produced the first atomic bombs. American scientists, many of them refugees from fascist regimes in Europe, took steps in 1939 to organize a project to exploit the newly recognized fission process for military purposes. The first contact with the government was made by C.B. Pegram of Columbia University, who arranged a conference between Enrico Fermi and the Navy Department in March of 1939. In the summer of 1939, Albert Einstein was persuaded by his fellow scientists to use his influence to present the military potential of an uncontrolled fission chain reaction to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In February 1940, $6,000 was made available to start the research under the supervision of a committee headed by L.J. Briggs, director of the National Bureau of Standards, later the National Institute of Standards and Technology. On December 6 of 1941, the project was put under the direction of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, headed by Vannevar Bush. After the U.S. entered World War II, the War Department was given joint responsibility for this new research project, because by mid-1942 it was obvious that a vast array of plot plants, laboratories, and manufacturing facilities would have to be constructed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for the assembled scientists to carry out their mission of creating the bomb. In June 1942, the Corps of Engineers Manhattan District was initially assigned management of the construction work because much of the early research had been performed at Columbia University itself in Manhattan, which is why it was called the Manhattan Project. In September 1942, Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves was placed in charge of all Army activities, chiefly engineering activities, relating to the project. Manhattan Project became the code name for the research work that would extend across the country to many different facilities and locations. It was known in 1940 that German scientists were working on a similar project and that the British were also exploring the problem and doing fission. In the fall of 1941, the Manhattan Project chemist Harold C. Urey accompanied Pegram to England to attempt to set up a cooperative effort with the British. And by 1943, a combined policy committee was established with Great Britain and Canada and the United States. In that year, a number of British and Canadian scientists moved to the United States to join the Manhattan Project. If the project were to achieve timely success, several lines of research and development had to be carried on simultaneously in parallel before it was certain whether any might succeed as a full bomb. The explosive materials then had to be produced and had to be suitable for use in an actual weapon. Uranium-235, the essential fissionable component of the postulated bomb, cannot be separated from its natural companion, the much more abundant uranium-238. By chemical means, the atoms of these respective isotopes must rather be separated from each other by physical means. Several physical methods to do this were intensively employed, and two were chosen. The electromagnetic process developed at the University of California, Berkeley under Ernesto Orlando Lawrence, and the diffusion process developed under Urey at Columbia University were combined. Both of these processes, particularly the diffusion method, required large, complex facilities and huge amounts of electric power to produce even small amounts of separated uranium-235. Philip Hogg Adelson developed a third method called the thermal diffusion method, which was also used for a time to effect a preliminary separation. These methods were put into production at a 70 square mile tract near Knoxville, Tennessee, which is the Tennessee site we were talking about. Originally, this site was known as the Clinton Engineer Works, but later it was called Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And Oak Ridge, like I said before, was the main laboratory for the project. Only one method was available for production of the fissionable material plutonium-239. It was developed at the Metallurgical Laboratory at the University of Chicago under the direction of Arthur Holly Compton and involved the transmutation in a reactor pile of uranium-238. In December 1942, Fermi finally succeeded in producing and controlling a fission chain reaction in his reactor pile in Chicago during his laboratory experiments. Quantity production of plutonium-239 required the construction of a reactor in great size and power, and that would release about 25,000 kilowatt hours of heat for each gram of plutonium that was produced and enriched. This required the development of chemical extraction procedures that would work under conditions never before encountered or tried. An intermediate step in putting this method into production was taken with the construction of a medium-sized reactor at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The large-scale production reactors were built on an isolated 1,000 square mile tract on the Columbia River north of Pasco, Washington. The Hanford Engineer Works is what that one was called in Washington. Before 1943, work on the design and functioning of the bomb itself was largely theoretical, and it was based on fundamental experiments carried out at a number of different locations. In that year, a laboratory directed by Robert Oppenheimer was created on an isolated mesa at Los Alamos, New Mexico, 34 miles north of Santa Fe, New Mexico. This laboratory was tasked with developing methods to reduce the fissionable products of the production plants to pure metal and to fabricate the metal to required shapes and energy levels. Methods of rapidly bringing together amounts of fissionable material to achieve a supercritical mass had to be devised, along with the actual construction of a deliverable weapon that would be dropped from a plane and fused to detonate at a proper moment in the air above the target. Most of these problems had to be solved before any appreciable amount of fissionable material could be produced and enriched, so that the first adequate amounts could be used at the fighting front with minimal delay. By the summer of 1945, amounts of plutonium-239 sufficient to produce a nuclear explosion had become available from the Hanford Works, and the weapon development and design were sufficiently advanced so that the actual field test of a nuclear weapon could be scheduled. Such a test was not a simple affair. Elaborate and complex equipment had to be assembled to provide a complex diagnosis of success or failure. By the time the original $6,000 that was authorized for the Manhattan Project had grown to $2 billion in the federal budget. So it is a $2 billion project at this point over 2 years. The first atomic bomb had exploded at 5:30 a.m. on July 16, 1945, at the Alamogordo Air Base, 120 miles south of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Oppenheimer had called the site Trinity, in reference to one of John Donne's holy sonnets. The bomb, a plutonium implosion device called Gadget, was raised to the top of a 100-foot steel tower and was designated zero. The area of the base of the tower was marked as ground zero, a term that would pass into common parlance and practice to describe the center of an event that was a nuclear explosion. The tower was surrounded by scientific equipment, with the remote monitoring taking place in bunkers occupied by scientists and a few dignitaries 10,000 yards away with special glasses on. The explosion came to an intense light flash, a sudden wave of heat, and later tremendous roar as the shock wave passed and echoed in the valley. A ball of fire rose rapidly, followed by a mushroom cloud extending 40,000 feet into the air. The bomb generated an explosive power equivalent to 15,000 to 20,000 tons of TNT. The tower was completely vaporized and the surrounding desert surface fused to glass for the radius of 800 yards around the explosion. The following month, 2 other atomic bombs produced by the project, the first using uranium-235 and the second using plutonium, were dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Neither city had been attacked during the U.S. strategic bombing campaign that had happened up to that point. The planners wished to demonstrate the destructive power of the bombs on a city that had not been touched. Hiroshima was selected as the primary target because of its military value. The city served as the headquarters of the Japanese Second Army. On August 6, 1945, at about 8:15 a.m. local time, a US B-29 bomber released a gun assembly fusion bomb dubbed Little Boy above Hiroshima. The weapon detonated at an altitude of 1,900 feet, and the explosive yield was estimated to be the equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. Some 70,000 people were killed instantly, and by the end of the year, the death toll had surpassed 100,000. 2/3 of the city's area was completely destroyed and leveled to the ground. By the morning of August 9th, 1945, the Soviet Union had declared war on Japan, but the Japanese government had still yet not communicated its intent to surrender to the Allies. A B-29 carrying the Fat Man, which was a plutonium implosion bomb, similar to the one used in the Trinity test, was initially dispatched to Kokura. Thick clouds and haze over Kokura prevented the bombardier from sighting the designated aim point, however, and the bomb proceeded to its secondary target, which was the port city of Nagasaki. At 11:02, the Fat Man bomb exploded at an altitude of 1,650 feet above the city. The bomb detonated with explosive force of 21,000 tons of TNT. So that you can see the plutonium bomb was actually a little stronger than the uranium bomb. An estimated 40,000 people were killed instantly in Nagasaki, and at least 30,000 more would die from their injuries and radiation poisoning by the end of the year. About 40% of the city's buildings were completely destroyed or severely damaged. Due to the area's uneven terrain, a significant part of Nagasaki, particularly in the southeastern industrial and government district, was relatively unscathed from the bomb. The Japanese initiated surrender negotiations the next day after Nagasaki. By this point, Gross had notified U.S. President Harry S. Truman that another bomb would be ready for delivery within a week if the surrender did not come. So you can see that really gives you a good summation of what the overall strategy was behind the Manhattan Project, the Trinity test that happened in the Los Alamos, New Mexico desert. And you can see what the aftermath was of this terrible decision that had to be made, the worst weapons ever created by man that never should be used again. And the decision that Truman had to make on whether it was worth doing it to try to end the war and try to save lives really on both sides as part of this process, since the Japanese were very stubborn about surrendering. Let's go ahead and talk about the Robert Oppenheim background, since he was a big driver of this project. So Robert Oppenheimer was born April 22nd, 1904 in New York, New York, and he died in 1967 in Princeton, New Jersey. He was an American theoretical scientist and physicist with science administration in his background. He's also a noted director of the Los Alamos laboratory during the Manhattan Project. Accusations of disloyalty led to a government hearing that resulted in the loss of his security clearance and position as advisor to the highest echelons of the U.S. government. The case became cause célèbre in the world of science because of its implications concerning political and moral issues relating to the role of scientists in government. Oppenheimer was the son of a German immigrant who has made his fortune by importing textiles into New York City. During his undergraduate studies at Harvard University, Oppenheimer excelled in Latin, Greek, physics, and chemistry, and published poetry and studied Eastern philosophy. After graduating in 1925, he sailed for England to do research at the Cavendish Laboratory at University of Cambridge, which, under leadership of Lord Ernest Rutherford, had an international reputation for its pioneering studies on atomic structure and fusion. At the Cavendish Laboratory, Oppenheimer had the opportunity to collaborate with British scientific community and its effects and advances using atomic research. Max Born invited Oppenheimer to the University of Göttingen, where he met other prominent physicists such as Niels Bohr and A.M. Dirac, and where in 1927 he received his doctorate. After short visits at science theaters in Leiden and Zurich, he returned to the United States to teach physics at the University of California, Berkeley, and at the California Institute of Technology. In the 1920s, the new quantum relativity theories were engaging the attention of science. That mass was equivalent to energy and that matter could be both wave-like and corpuscular carried implications seen only dimly at the time. Oppenheimer's early research was devoted in particular to early energy processes of subatomic particles, including electrons, positrons, and cosmic rays. He also did groundbreaking work on neutron stars and black holes. Since quantum theory had just been proposed only a few years earlier, The university post provided him an excellent opportunity to devote his entire career to exploration and development to its full significance. In addition, he trained a whole generation of U.S. physicists who were generally affected by his qualities of leadership and intellectual independence. The rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany stirred the first interest in politics for Oppenheimer. In 1936, he sided with the Republic during the Civil War in Spain, where he became acquainted with communist students. Although his father's death in 1937 left Oppenheimer a fortune that allowed him to subsidize anti-fascist organizations, the tragic suffering inflicted by Joseph Stalin on Russian scientists led him to withdraw his associations with the Communist Party later. In fact, he never really joined the party, and at the same time, he reinforced in him a liberal democracy philosophy. In 1939, Oppenheimer began an affair with Catherine Punig, a graduate student in botany at the University of California, Los Angeles. Punig divorced her husband and married Oppenheimer in 1940. After the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany in 1939, the physicist Albert Einstein, Leo Szilard, and Eugene Wiener warned the United States government of the danger threatening all of humanity if the Nazis should be the first to make the first nuclear or atomic bomb. Oppenheimer then began to seek a process for the separation of uranium-235 from the natural uranium and to determine the critical mass uranium required to make such a bomb. In other words, what was the theory that needed to be achieved by such a project? In August 1942, the U.S. Army had given the responsibility of organizing the efforts of British and U.S. physicists to seek a way to harness nuclear energy for military purposes, an effort that became known as the Manhattan Project. Oppenheimer was instructed to establish and administer a laboratory to carry out this assignment and begin his research. In 1943, he chose the plateau of Los Alamos near Santa Fe, New Mexico. For reasons that have not been made clear, Oppenheimer in 1942 initiated discussions with the military security agents that culminated with the implication that some of his friends and acquaintances were agents of the Soviet government. This led to the dismissal of a personal friend on the faculty at the University of California. In a 1954 security meeting after the war, he described his contribution to those discussions as a tissue of lies. The joint effort of outstanding scientists at Los Alamos culminated in the first nuclear explosion, which happened on July 16, 1945, at the Trinity site near Alamogordo, New Mexico. After the surrender of Germany in October of the same year, Oppenheimer resigned his post. In 1947, he became head of the Institute for Advanced Study and served from 1947 until 1952 as chairman of the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission, which in October 1949 opposed development of the hydrogen bomb. On December 21st, 1953, he was notified of a military security report unfavorable to him, and he was accused of having associated with communists in the past, of delaying the naming of Soviet agents, and of opposing the building of the hydrogen bomb. The following year, a security hearing declared him not guilty of treason, but ruled that he could not have access to military secrets any longer. As a result, his contract as advisor to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission was canceled. The Federation of American Scientists immediately came to his defense with a protest against the trial. Oppenheimer was made the worldwide symbol of a scientist who, while trying to resolve the moral problems that arise from scientific discovery, became the victim of a witch hunt. He spent the last years of his life working out ideas on the relationship between science and society and railing against the use of the bomb ever again. In 1963, U.S. President Lyndon Johnson presented Oppenheimer with the Enrico Fermi Award of the Atomic Energy Commission to recognize him for his work on behalf of the country. Oppenheimer retired from the Institute of Advanced Study in 1966 and then died of throat cancer the following year. In 2014, 60 years after the proceedings that effectively ended his career, the U.S. Department of Energy released the full declassified transcript of the hearing. While many of the details were already known, the newly released material bolstered Oppenheimer's assertions of loyalty and reinforced the perception that a brilliant scientist had been brought low by a bureaucratic cocktail of professional jealousy and McCarthyism. In 2022, the Department of Energy finally vacated the revocation of Oppenheimer's security clearance. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm claimed that the bias and unfairness of a flawed process had led to his exile from the nuclear establishment. In Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer movie that came out in 2023, cast by Cillian Murphy, who was in the title role of the film, and explored Oppenheimer's role in the development of the atomic bomb and the events that led to the 1954 security hearing. If you haven't had a chance to see that film, it is really excellent. I would highly recommend it. It's one of the better biography type films that you can see, and the amount of history and the adherence to that history in the film is really excellent. So let's go ahead. We're going to take a look at a quick video of the history of the Manhattan Project, and then we'll come back and we're going to talk a little bit about the Truman decision and the bomb itself.
The Manhattan Project proved to be a success on July 16, 1945. The shockwave from the first atomic bomb ever detonated swept from a New Mexico desert to Albuquerque, obliterating everything in its reach with heat hot enough to vaporize steel. The theoretical physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer and the bomb's architects stood 32 kilometers away, watching years of work come to fruition. As the sky brightened with a fire that outshone the sun, and a mushroom-shaped cloud soared 12 kilometers into the air, the scientists knew that the secret military program to develop the atomic bomb, known as the Manhattan Project, had been successful. Oppenheimer stated, "We knew that the world would not be the same." Years after the Manhattan Project ended, he uttered the famous words, "Now I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." The Manhattan Project started with a letter on President Franklin D. Roosevelt's desk on October 6, 1939. The letter said, "The Nazis have made new breakthroughs in nuclear research that could lead to what they describe as extremely powerful bombs of a new type. Yours sincerely, Albert Einstein." Yes, he himself. That physics chap whose formula you well know. Einstein was not a spy, but he had a couple of friends who kept an eye on the news. In December 1938, two German scientists found by accident that uranium atoms could be split into two radioactive parts, and two scientists in the United States, Enrico Fermi and Leo Szilard, believed that the Germans' finding could be used to create a nuclear bomb more powerful than anything the world had ever seen. Szilard and Fermi started off by trying to develop a nuclear reactor on their own, backed only by the resources of Columbia University. But an article in the newspaper profoundly upset Szilard. He found out that Germany had seized Czechoslovakia's uranium mines and forbade the country from selling it to anyone other than the Third Reich. Szilard soon came to understand that the Nazis were developing a nuclear bomb of their own. Worried that Roosevelt would not listen to someone such as him, Szilard arranged a meeting with Einstein, shared his fears, and convinced him to sign the letter. He handed the note to Alexander Sachs, an economist and science buff who was a personal friend of the president. Roosevelt eventually agreed to meet Sachs on October 11th, a month after the news broke that Germany had invaded Poland. Roosevelt attempted to understand what the scientist was trying to say. After all, no one, apart from scientists, had ever heard of anything as earth-shattering as an atomic bomb. Finally, the president said, "What you are after is to see that the Nazis don't blow us up." This was something he could grasp. Roosevelt then sent for General Edwin Watson, handed him the papers, and ordered the Manhattan Project to begin as soon as possible. Initially, Roosevelt all but offered the Manhattan Project funding, agreeing to buy uranium and graphite for Szilard and Fermi's experiments. Not many believed that an atomic bomb was feasible. Some estimated the chances of success at 100,000 to 1. Even Fermi stated that his odds of success were remote. The biggest issue was the bomb's weight. If a nuclear bomb was even possible, a functional one would have to weigh at least 40 tons, Einstein's letter to Roosevelt said. These bombs may well turn out to be too heavy to be carried by air. Powerful as it was, the atomic bomb would do the US no favors if they could not deploy it on enemy ground. The Americans were not the only ones with a nuclear program. Two German refugees in England, Rudolf Peierls and Otto Frisch, worked hard to beat their former compatriots to the nuclear bomb, and in March 1940, made the breakthrough that would alter the project. They found out that a large amount of uranium was needed to begin with, and then one of its isotopes had to be split off from it, specifically uranium-235. All they needed was around half a kilo or so of the isotope to build a bomb that could blow up an entire city. The energy generated by exploding such a superbomb is roughly the same as that produced by the blast of 1,000 tons of dynamite. Then it produces, for an instant, a temperature similar to that of the sun's core. The researchers also warned that a nuclear bomb would release radioactive material that the wind could scatter around the world, something they knew would be horrible. Indeed, even days after the explosion, anyone entering the affected area could die or develop cancer. Once they had figured everything out, the Manhattan Project was ready to begin. Up until then, England was the leading investor in a nuclear program. In 1943, the USA had already put its first $1 billion into the Manhattan Project, the equivalent of $15 billion today. By comparison, the British, who had been in the lead 3 years earlier, had spent only £500,000. But the two countries' projects were soon combined, as the costs were enormous. The Manhattan Project was brought to life on September 17, 1942, when General Leslie Groves was put in charge. Prior to Groves taking over the project, the scientists were battling to secure funding, as they practically had to beg. They were given a mere $90 million sum to build 4 of the planet's first nuclear power plants, and struggled to do anything with that meager amount. The atomic bomb project was given the same priority rating as a TNT factory building, and so every request they made was pushed into the background. Groves turned everything around. Within 2 days of joining the team, he spooked the administration into giving the Manhattan Project the priority of receiving the highest possible urgency whenever requested. On September 29th, 12 days after joining the team, Groves bought 56,000 acres of land in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, to enrich uranium. Landowners living there were evicted from their land with little compensation, without ever knowing why. They were forced to leave and watch from a distance as their former homes became a total exclusion area, with around 80,000 employees. A public school in Los Alamos County, New Mexico was seized to create the Los Alamos National Laboratory, where the bomb was to be developed. A team of the country's leading physicists was stationed there, including names such as Enrico Fermi and Richard Feynman. And heading them up was the man chosen by Groves, J. Robert Oppenheimer, who is now known as the bomb's Thomas Shelby. Everything about the Manhattan Project was kept secret. The workers at Oak Ridge could not even be told what they were doing. If they asked questions, they could be fired on the spot. One worker described it this way: "When the pointer went from 0 to 100, I turned a valve. The pointer went back to 0. I would turn another valve, and the pointer would go back to 100, all day long." Security was even stricter at Los Alamos. Even Einstein and Szilard, the scientists whose letter had kicked off the Manhattan Project, were practically barred from entering. Szilard had some clearance, but Groves restricted his role. He was a German citizen and a pacifist, which made Groves extremely tense. He ordered Szilard to be dismissed from the squad, and when he failed to approve the order, had the FBI follow him wherever he went. Einstein was cut off completely. The military deemed him unfit to deal with highly secret matters related to national defense. Professor Einstein is an extreme radical, a military memo stated at the time, and Einstein was labeled a communist. Even the press was tight-lipped in its coverage. Nothing related to atomic fission was allowed in the newspapers, especially the tabloids. It was all this confidentiality, ironically, that caught the Soviet eye. In 1942, a Soviet scientist named Georgy Flyarov alerted Stalin that for 2 years the Americans had not uttered a single word about nuclear fission. His only explanation, Flyarov told him, was that they were working on the bomb. That was the start of the Soviets' espionage scheme. Einstein never managed to get into the Los Alamos National Laboratory, but Klaus Fuchs did, and reported all that he had learned to Soviet military intelligence. A couple also managed to steal the atomic bomb project and hand it over to the Soviets. On July 16, 1945, a nuclear bomb called Trinity was carried into the New Mexico desert. 6 years of research and testing later, the Manhattan Project scientists had finally created what they believed to be a workable nuclear weapon. It was now time to test it. Just in case something went wrong, the bomb was packed into a containment vessel made from 214 tons of steel, with walls 14 inches thick. If it failed, Groves and Oppenheimer thought the containment vessel would allow them to retrieve the plutonium inside safely. If it did work, the bomb would vaporize the steel. Nobody knew quite what to expect. Prior to detonating the bomb, the men from the Los Alamos National Laboratory gambled on the magnitude of the explosion. The bomb went off with a force of 20 kilotons, eclipsing all predictions. Oppenheimer is reported to have been buzzing with joy that day. The bomb was to be put into use in less than 30 days. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and only 3 days later, a second bomb was unleashed on Nagasaki. The blasts killed about 105,000 people on the first day and critically injured another 94,000. A further 100,000 died in the few months following the explosions. As far as Groves was concerned, the bombing of Japan was a triumph. In his final speech to the Manhattan Project scientists, he lauded them as heroes, saying, "You built the weapon which ended the war and thereby saved countless American lives." Not everyone agreed with his belief that this was a victory for peace. Einstein was heartbroken. Hundreds of thousands were dead, and he could not find anyone to blame but himself. "If I had known that the Germans would not be able to develop an atomic bomb," he said, "I would have done nothing." The project certainly changed the world forever. In 1949, Soviet scientists, using data stolen from the Manhattan Project, devised their own nuclear bomb, modeled after the one that fell on Nagasaki. This signaled the start of the Cold War. Even today, the world lives under the constant threat of nuclear havoc. Oppenheimer came to regret what he had undertaken. He spent the Cold War fighting for an end to the nuclear arms race, campaigning so vigorously for peace that he ended up before the House Un-American Activities Committee on charges of being a communist. "The atomic bomb was the turning of the screw," said Oppenheimer, reflecting on his legacy. "It made the prospect of a future war unbearable."
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. We are now prepared to destroy more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. it was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July the 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware. We have spent more than $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history, and we have won. But the greatest marvel is not the size of the enterprise, its secrecy, or its cost, but the achievement of scientific brains in making it work. And hardly less marvelous has been the capacity of industry to design and of labor to operate the machines and methods to do things never done before. Both science and industry work together under the direction of the United States Army, which achieved a unique success in an amazingly short time. It is doubtful if such another combination could be got together in the world. What has been done is the greatest achievement of organized science in history.
You see a lot of interesting things coming out of that video. The first one, Roosevelt was completely dumbfounded to try to understand what they were talking about and how powerful this bomb could be. So he tried to understand it in a very simple way when he read Einstein's letter and asked for an interpretation of it. Essentially, you're telling me that they have a bomb that could blow all of us up. And it was a very simple way of thinking of it, but it got him to take action and got him to create this Manhattan Project and to start hiring people like Groves and others. You also saw that this project was so super sensitive and so classified in its nature that anybody who crossed the Americans in this goal to try to create the first bomb got pushed out of the circle, including Einstein, including eventually Oppenheimer after the war. They got accused of being communists and they got pushed out of general science entirely, largely because they started to doubt that this was really a good idea to create the bomb in the first place. But as you can see, the cat was out of the bag and this was going to happen. The Americans were intent on getting it first and then eventually intent on using it to end the war and stop all the killing. Again, the estimates of what it would take to invade Japan and succumb Japan completely was about 400,000 men would have been killed on the American and Allied side. And that was, in most planners' estimation, not acceptable to the American people. Some other interesting things there, you saw the bomb itself when they dropped it at the Trinity site, the first one ever in July of 1945. They really had no idea what to expect. They only had estimates and they had guesses, but it ended up coming out 2.5 times more powerful than they expected, which they actually celebrated as a great success. And I felt like that with that bomb explosion and that test, and one more that they would do several weeks later, that they had a bomb that was ready for action and ready to be deployed. They had also, by the way, shrunk that bomb down small enough where they could really hypothetically get it on almost any kind of bomber airplane. Most of the airplanes that were bombers at the time could carry this weapon. They had shrunk it down so much over the past year. So some interesting things there. You saw Oppenheimer, of course, was the leading person at the Los Alamos lab, who was generating a lot of the science that was behind the actual bomb creation and the enrichment that was happening. Of course, a lot of the enrichment was occurring in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and then being transported by secure shipments via trucks that were escorted by tanks and other military vehicles from Oak Ridge, Tennessee to Los Alamos. So a very interesting process there, bringing enrichment to the desert for the actual testing. So those are some of the really interesting facts there from the videos you saw about the Manhattan Project itself. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the surrender of Japan, and then we're going to actually get into the terrible and awful decision that Harry S. Truman had to make about whether to drop the 2 bombs on the 2 cities in Japan. You can imagine how much this weighed on him because he realized how serious this decision was and that it was going to kill so many people. but he really had to weigh what the upside of it was going to be to end the war, and that in the end, it probably saved many, many lives on both sides. So let's go ahead and talk about the surrender of Japan after the two bombs were dropped. The surrender of the Empire of Japan in World War II was announced by Emperor Hirohito on August 15th and formally signed on September 2nd of 1945, ending the war officially across the board. By the end of July 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy was incapable of conducting major operations, and the Allied invasion of Japan was imminent. Together with the United Kingdom and China, the United States had called for unconditional surrender of Japan in the Potsdam Declaration on July 25, 1945, the alternative being prompt and utter destruction. While publicly stating their intent to fight on to the bitter end, Japan's leaders, also known as the Big Six, were privately making entreaties to the publicly neutral Soviet Union to mediate peace on terms more favorable to the Japanese. While maintaining a sufficient level of diplomatic engagement with the Japanese to give them the impression they might be willing to mediate, the Soviets were covertly preparing to attack Japanese forces in Manchuria and Korea, in fulfillment of promises that they had secretly made to the US and the UK at Tehran and Yalta conferences. On August 6th of 1945, at 8:15 a.m. local time, the United States detonated an atomic bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 16 hours later, American President Harry S. Truman called again for Japan's surrender, warning them to expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which had never been seen on this earth. Late on August 8, 1945, several days later, in accordance with the Yalta agreements, but in violation of the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Act, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. And soon after midnight on August 9, 1945, the Soviet Union invaded the Japanese puppet state of Manchuria. Hours later, the United States dropped the second atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Nagasaki. Emperor Hirohito subsequently ordered the Supreme Council for the direction of the war to accept the terms of the Allies that they had set out in the Potsdam Declaration. After several more days of behind-the-scenes negotiations and a failed coup d'etat by hardliners in the Japanese military, Emperor Hirohito gave a recorded radio address across the empire on August 15th, announcing the surrender of Japan to the Allies. On August 28th, the occupation of Japan began by the Supreme Allied Commander of Allied Powers. The formal surrender ceremony was held on September 2nd aboard the United States Navy battleship USS Missouri, at which officials from the Japanese government signed the Japanese instrument of surrender, ending hostilities with the Allies. Allied civilians and military personnel alike celebrated VJ Day, the end of the war in the Pacific. However, isolated soldiers and other personnel from Japan's forces scattered throughout Asia and the Pacific and refused to surrender for many months and even years afterwards, some into the 1970s. The role of the atomic bombings in Japan's unconditional surrender and the ethics of the two attacks and whether they should have been done in the first place are even debated still today. The state of war formally ended when the Treaty of San Francisco came into force April 28th of 1952. 4 more years passed before Japan and the Soviet Union signed the Soviet-Japanese Joint Declaration in 1958, which formally brought an end to their state of war. In 1945, the Japanese had suffered a string of defeats for nearly 2 years in the Southwest Pacific, India, Manchuria campaign, and the Philippines campaign. In July 1944, following the loss of Saipan, General Hideki was replaced as prime minister by General Kunai Kosyo, who declared that the Philippines would be the site of the decisive battle of the war. After the Japanese loss at the Philippines, Kosyo was in turn replaced by Admiral Suzuki. The Allies captured the nearby islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in the first half of 1945. Okinawa was to be staging area for Operation Downfall, which was the Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands. Following Germany's defeat, the Soviet Union began quietly redeploying its battle-hardened troops from the European theater to the Far East theater to support the war against Japan. The Allied submarine campaign and mining of Japanese coastal waters had largely destroyed the Japanese merchant fleet. With few natural resources in their country, Japan was dependent upon raw materials, particularly oil imported from Manchuria and other parts of East Asian mainland, and from the conquered territory of the Dutch East Indies. The destruction of the Japanese merchant fleet, combined with the strategic bombing of Japanese industry, had wrecked Japanese war economy completely. Production of the coal, iron, steel, rubber, and other vital supplies was only a fraction of what they needed for the war. As a result of the losses it had suffered, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to be an effective fighting force. Following a series of raids on the Japanese shipyard at Kure, the only major warships in somewhat fighting order were 6 aircraft carriers, 4 cruisers, and 1 battleship, of which many were heavily damaged that day, and none could be fueled adequately. Although 19 destroyers and 38 submarines were still operational, their use were also very limited by the lack of fuel that was available. Faced with the prospect of an invasion of the home islands, starting with Kyushu, and the prospect of a Soviet invasion of Manchuria, Japan's last source of natural resources, the War Journal of Imperial Headquarters, concluded in 1944, "We can no longer direct the war with any hope of success. The only course left for Japan is 100 million people to sacrifice their lives by charging the enemy to make them lose the will to fight." So you can see what the thought process was of the Japanese. It was very serious. They did not want to surrender. They were very stubborn. They were willing to sacrifice all of their people in light of this, and had decided that they were not going to surrender under any costs. There was going to be endless war forever. One of the major reasons, of course, why we decided to drop the bomb was because of the stubbornness, and we were getting intelligence to that effect. So in terms of President Truman's decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, it was driven by the desire to end World War II quickly and to save American and Allied lives, potentially avoiding a costly invasion of the Japan mainland. Truman believed that the atomic bombs would force Japan to surrender, preventing a prolonged and bloody war in the Pacific. A potential invasion of Japan was estimated to cost at least 400,000 and maybe 500,000 lives of Allied and American soldiers. The Japanese government's stubbornness and refusal to surrender unconditionally, and the use of atomic bombs was used to compel them to do so. The atomic bombs were the result of the secret Manhattan Project, which we've discussed, and Truman had to decide whether to use this new weapon, a very serious decision, maybe the worst decision a U.S. president has ever had to make. Truman and his advisors believed that the atomic bombs were necessary and a terrible evil that needed to be done to end the war and to save lives, both American and Japanese. While there were other options, such as a continued blockade, a bombing campaign, Truman believed the atomic bombs offered the quickest and most decisive path to victory to end the war after 5 years. The use of atomic bombs remains a highly debated topic, with some arguing that it was a necessary evil and others arguing that it was a moral outrage and never should have even been considered. So you can see that the debate is still going on even today over the decision that Truman made, over the Manhattan Project, over the bomb itself, which of course has now proliferated all over the world and many, many countries have it. The other incredible thing, if you think about it, is the bombs of today that we look at are over 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So if you can even imagine, the bombs of today are so powerful they could take out a whole continent with one bomb. And so that's what we're talking about here. And you can see in this particular picture, To Hell and Back is a really excellent book about the Hiroshima disaster and the aftermath of that one bomb that destroyed the city. So you can imagine the decisions that were having to be made here and how horrific this particular weapon was and how much more powerful they are today. Here's another great book you should consider, First into Nagasaki. There's a really great book about the people who went into the village about 4 weeks later just to see what was there and to try to help the people. So really interesting here. The things that we had to weigh as Americans and allies to decide if we were going to take out the Japanese in this way. They had been incredibly stubborn and did not want to surrender, and were telling us that they were going to fight to the last man. So let's go ahead and take a look at a preview of the great movie Oppenheimer, which I highly. So you can see from that long preview of the Oppenheimer film, it really is excellently made. The acting is fantastic. The cast is really great. The writing is really well done. It really adheres to the history that they were dealing with. I think it captures the real heaviness of the topic and how serious this project was and how much it was going to change the world. It was successful. You can see a number of things it was realizing to them. They did not know what was going to happen when they hit that button for the first time in the Trinity test. They really had no idea. They were hopeful that all of their measurements were true and that their science was real and that they would be able to control and contain that particular test and explosion. But you saw there was some doubt in their minds that it might blow up the entire world. And I can't imagine how they felt when they were able to control that first explosion and realize that they were going to be able to put this particular device into action and be able to control it. So that was really heavy, and you can see that they really did a great job of showing that. In addition, you can see the seriousness of trying to beat the Nazis to the bomb. They knew the Nazis were working on it, mainly because of that letter that came forward by Einstein and his associates. So they really wanted to beat the Nazis to the bomb. And then also you saw there were some really great scenes in the movie where they talk about the fact that the Soviets had been spying at Los Alamos, and they actually had gathered a lot of information, and they actually had plans of the plutonium bomb that was dropped in the second test. And they were able to take those plans and 4 years later, in 1949, realize them in their own test of the plutonium bomb. So a lot of really serious things happening there. As you can see, it was very difficult, a project this large in so many different locations around the country, to contain all of it and not allow spies to find out what was going on. They did their best, but as you see, they were not able to do so. So hopefully you enjoyed that preview of a great movie, Oppenheimer, and hopefully you enjoyed a lot learning about the Manhattan Project, about Oppenheimer, about the serious decisions that Harry S. Truman had to make and whether we were going to actually drop this bomb to try to end the war. The Japanese surrender and how interesting it was there, and how they kind of forced the Americans' hand by saying that they would go to the last man. And hopefully you see the seriousness of this topic, that the atomic bomb really can never be used again. It's such a horrific weapon that has been created by scientists that it can only be used as a deterrent going forward. So again, hopefully you enjoyed that. Take a look at the Oppenheimer movie. It's really fantastic. You can read several of the really great Oppenheimer books that we've shown on the series tonight. And please like this video and subscribe to the channel. And we look forward to seeing you next time on Traveling Through History. We have a lot of great content coming your way. Have a great evening.